Greetings. My name is Jim Bacon. I'm author of the book Boomergeddon, and like many Americans, I'm really worried about the future of our country. President Obama and his accomplices in Congress have run the budget and the economy into the ground. The Republicans have decried the deficit spending, but they don't inspire much confidence either. Earlier this month, House Republican leaders issued a Pledge to America describing how they plan to govern when they take control in January. The most substantive promise in the document was to cut government spending to pre-stimulus, pre-bailout levels, basically back to 2008. Well, woo-hoo! The cuts would save about $100 billion a year and, I quote, put us on a path to begin paying down the debt and balancing the budget. To begin paying down the debt? Oh, great. Cutting $100 billion out of a $3.7 trillion budget is not progress. It's a rounding error. Here's the ugly reality. By 2025, possibly sooner, the U.S. government will go into default. By default, I mean that the government will be unable to repay its debt and no one will lend it any more money. The feds will be forced to operate on a pay-as-you-go basis, spending no more money than it brings in from taxes, and creating a 40% budget gap to be met by some combination of cutting spending, increasing taxes, repudiating the debt, or inflating the money supply. The resulting chaos will plunge this country and much of the world into another Great Depression. Let me show you why default is a near inevitability and why cutting $100 billion won't accomplish much of anything at all. This is President Obama's 10-year budget forecast. Deficits will run above $1.4 trillion this year and next. Supposedly, they'll drop to half that level as economic growth takes hold and spending restraint kicks in. But even under those fantasyland assumptions, the current budget path will add $8 trillion to the national debt by 2020. Total debt will exceed $21 trillion. How big is $21 trillion? Is it like $21 gazillion? Would it equal a stack of $10 bills stretching to the moon? The human mind can't relate. So, let me bring this down to a personal level. Meet Fred Fingelmeyer. He has a college degree and works in a middle management job. He's married, has 2 children, a dog, and 3 hamsters. Here is his lovely wife, Lorna. She sells real estate, and she's the mom to 2 wonderful kids, Muffy and Trip. The current national debt stands at $13.5 trillion, $44,000 for each man, woman, and child in the United States. That means Fred and his family owe a $176,000 share, on top of their mortgage, car payments, college tuitions, and credit card debt for Trip's tattoos. But the situation for Fred is actually worse than that. 47% of the U.S. population pays no personal income tax. Fred and Lorna both work, so they're in a pretty high tax bracket. Given the progressive nature of the tax code, the burden of supporting the debt lands on the backs of the half of the population that pays taxes. As a practical matter, Fred and Lorna are liable for double the national average, or $350,000. Okay, let's fast forward 10 years. The Fingelmeyers are still a happy family of 4. Fred and Lorna are still working, and Buffy is helping out by selling nose piercings on eBay. Trip is just back from the state penitentiary, and he's now working at McDonald's. Basing on the official Obama budget forecast, adjusted for their status as income tax payers, the family will be shouldering a $542,000 share of the federal debt by 2020. If only that were the end of it. Obama's official forecast makes all sorts of optimistic assumptions that, quite frankly, are hard to believe. First, Obama assumes that Congress, after spending money like a valley girl with daddy's credit card, will suddenly show restraint and freeze discretionary domestic spending for several years running. Obama also assumes that the U.S. economy will grow at a rate averaging 3.4% annually for 10 straight years, with no recession. Here's what that looks like. The black line shows projected growth in Obama world. By way of comparison, the envisioned expansion is comparable to the internet-fueled Clinton expansion in blue, only it lasts a couple of years longer. Is it just me, or do you question whether we're experiencing an economic boom? Consumers are still reeling from too much debt, real estate prices are still collapsing, banks are still taking hits to their balance sheets, state and local governments are still trimming back their payrolls. I asked my friends at Chimera Economics and Analytics to create a model based on the Obama budget forecast and run a few what-if scenarios for me. I wondered what would happen if economic growth averaged 1 percentage point less than postulated by the Obama team. I also wondered what would happen if there was a mild recession sometime in the next 6, 7, 8 years. The solid black line is the baseline Obama forecast for deficits over the next 10 years. The solid red line shows what happens if growth slows by 1 percentage point annually. The dotted line adds the impact of a mild recession later in the decade. So, what happens to the deficit? It shoots from a bit under $1 trillion in 2020 under the Obama scenario to more than $1.7 trillion. The national debt reaches $29 trillion. That's a lot of money. What does it mean to Fred? Well, his share of the national debt by then won't be $540,000. It will be $750,000. Let's examine another assumption. In Obama world, interest rates stay low. The 10-year Treasury bond never exceeds 5.3%. What happens if the O team is wrong about that? What if interest rates climb to levels we experienced as recently as 1990, as some reputable economists like Tim Bond at Barclays Bank suggest they will? I went back to Chimera for an answer. To avoid the appearance of stacking the deck, we assumed that interest rates would stay low for 3 years while the Europeans work out their own sovereign debt issues and investors engage in a flight to safety to U.S. Treasuries. Then we figured interest rates would climb to 10% by the end of the decade. Just by tweaking this one assumption in the budget model, the budget deficit in 2020 would reach $2.8 trillion a year, and the national debt would be $36 trillion. The Finkelmeyer family's share of the debt by 2020? $930,000. Just for yucks, we ran one more scenario for the year 2020. What happens if we assumed higher interest rates on treasuries, slower economic growth, and a recession later in the decade? Head for the hills, baby. Stock up on shotgun shells and buy that cabin in the woods. We're talking about a $3.4 trillion annual deficit. Fred's family share of the debt would be piling up at the rate of $40,000 a year. Can you say Boomergeddon? Okay, let's assume that somehow we dodge those bullets. What happens beyond the 10-year time horizon of the official forecast? Well, that's when the boomers enter retirement and Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid payments shoot through the roof. In the decade of the 2020s, Medicare spending will increase from a bit over 2% of the economy to nearly 4%, adding hundreds of billions of dollars a year to the budget. Medicaid will pose the same problem on a smaller scale. Then, around 2023, we hit another crisis, the drawdown of the Social Security Trust Fund. The trust fund will peak around $4.3 trillion that year. At that point, benefits will exceed payroll taxes and interest income. The Social Security Administration will go to the Treasury Department and say, "Remember all that money we entrusted to you years ago? We need it back." But Treasury won't have the money. It will have to borrow the money on the open market at the very same time it is already borrowing $1 trillion, $2 trillion, $3 trillion a year, pick your scenario, to finance the rest of government. There's one more thing we have to consider. As the national debt grows, so does the interest on the debt. In the 2020s, those interest payments will basically take over. Do a little math. 10% interest on a $2 trillion deficit is $200 billion. That's more than we'll be spending then on the entire departments of agriculture, commerce, education, energy, and housing and urban development combined. Just 1 year's interest on 1 year's deficit. It's the flip side of the miracle of compound interest. It's the horror of compound interest. Once the interest burden gets that big and starts snowballing, you cannot stop it. It's game over. It's Boomergeddon. At some point in the 2020s, or maybe sooner, investors will stop lending. The U.S. will be unable to roll over its debt, and the country will go into default. Government spending will crash, draining 10% or more out of the economy and pushing the country into a depression. Call it fiscal stimulus in reverse. Succulus. Congress may try raising taxes or cutting spending, but that will aggravate the recession. The Treasury might repudiate foreign debt, but that would spark a crippling capital flight. The Federal Reserve might crank up the printing press, but that would drive down the dollar, ignite inflation, and push interest rates higher. Once we reach Boomergeddon, there are no options. There is no easy way out. Every path before us is a path of pain. So, what's to be done? My advice is to take the pain now. Close the budget gap by $1 trillion a year, even at the risk of triggering a double-dip recession. Pay the price now while the pain is still bearable, rather than delay the inevitable and suffer greater agonies later. That's not exactly a winning political message. It's not exactly Ronald Reagan and Morning in America. It's depressing, and no one wants to hear it. But that's the way it is. My wife tells me that I'm way too gloomy and that I need to close the speech on a high note. So, let's take a look at the bright side. When Boomergeddon strikes and the government can't repay its Social Security bonds, don't worry. Social Security generates enough money from payroll taxes that it can still pay 75% of scheduled benefits. 75%. That's better than 50% on average that authorities say Bernie Madoff's investors will get back. When Boomergeddon strikes, you can thank your lucky stars you live in Virginia, a state with a AAA bond rating. Imagine if you lived in Los Angeles. You'd be living in a bankrupt city, in a bankrupt state, in a bankrupt country. When gangs of marauding, post-apocalyptic thugs out of a Mad Max movie come rolling through town, Virginia will have the resources to field a police force and National Guard. When Boomergeddon strikes, you can gloat that conservatives were right about the welfare state and unsustainable entitlements, and liberals were wrong. Maybe people will listen when you talk about rebuilding America's failed institutions around the principles of small government, self-reliance, and personal responsibility. Have a great day.